Happy Pride, readers. Welcome to Pride Book Fest. I'm Stephen Salvatore, they, them, and he, him, and I'm the author of Can't Take That Away. Here it is. And I'm so excited to bring you Owning Our Voices, Writing While Queer. Today, we're going to have a nuanced discussion about the ways in which Own Voices has impacted queer writers and particularly the online discourse that has taken place over the last few years about identity. I want to preface this discussion by saying that this is a hard conversation, and there's a great deal of bravery being exhibited here by each and every one of these incredible authors who are participating. So I hope that everyone viewing will listen, truly listen to what they all have to say, because it's important. So with that said, let's meet our panelists.
Hi, I'm Becky Albertalli. My pronouns are she, her. And my most recent book is called Kate in Waiting, but I am best known for Simon versus the Homo Sapiens Agenda, which was turned into Love, Simon. And I would say I'm also best known for writing a Medium post last year that got a lot of traction that's related to this topic.
Hi, my name is Sophie Gonzalez. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the author of Only Mostly Devastated, Perfect on Paper, and I'm the co-author of If This Gets Out, which comes out in December.
Hello, everyone. Happy Pride Month. My name is Rod Pulido. My pronouns are he, him. Currently, I'm on submission with my manuscript, Chasing Pacquiao, but I'm probably best known for my coming out essay, Late to the Party. So just happy to be here.
My name is Ashley Woodfolk. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the author of The Beauty That Remains, When You Were Everything, and the Fly Girl series. I only have the first two here. I also have a novel coming out this summer called Blackout that I co-wrote with a bunch of my friends that we're super excited about. And I have my first novel in verse coming out next year called Nothing Burns as Bright as You. And it's super gay. So.
I love that. And I just want to start off by saying thank you all I will thank you all till the end of time, but I think this is a really special conversation and I'm so happy to have you all here. So I'd like to start off first by discussing the premise behind Own Voices and the Own Voices hashtag. So for a little bit of context, it was created in 2015 by author Corinne Dalvis with the purpose of being able to easily identify and recommend books written by authors who share the same marginalized identities as their protagonists. It really started for marginalized readers with the intention of helping them find stories that could speak to authentic experiences to, in a sense, help weed out stories by writers writing outside of their own identities. As writers, we've all cut our teeth during the rise of the Own Voices and We Need Diverse Books movements, both of which have been incredible, valuable tools for both writers and readers to share in and find authentic stories about marginalized identities from writers who share the backgrounds of their main characters. So, in what positive ways has the publishing industry changed due to the Own Voices hashtag from your points of view?
I can start. What people may or may not know about me is that I worked in publishing for about 10 years, during which my books began to be published. And so I sort of have a dual, I guess, perspective on Own Voices because I saw it from sort of the interior, like what was happening within the industry, and then also the exterior as a background myself. And so it was really interesting. I think that there was definitely a shift that happened within publishing houses where, as before, I had been in multiple rooms where there were conversations about characters who looked a certain way being on the cover, characters with certain identities doing certain things on covers. Even, we already have a book with, insert marginalized identity here for this season, we probably should just focus on that one and not necessarily take on any others if they're similar. And I use the word similar very loosely. So I went from sort of being in rooms where conversations like that were happening to rooms that were a lot more, there were definitely like awkward moments where you knew people were like sort of trying to do the right thing. And then it slowly sort of morphed into, oh no, like this is serious. We actually have to pay attention to what's happening. You know, this is a movement. It's not a trend. And this is important to the industry as a whole if we really want to stay relevant and provide readers with, you know, more of what they're looking for. So I think that shift is happening much more quickly in children's lit than like on the adult side. I do still think, you know, we have work to do, but I do think that it's becoming a lot more. People are just a lot more open to possibilities and stories that they weren't open to before. Everyone from editors, you know, all the way to marketing, publicity, and like being more thoughtful about how to market books with characters that have different identities and own voices, stories, and stuff. So I don't want to take up too much time, but like that was like the industry sort of part of it that I experienced. And then on the author side, I feel like I saw it happening with a lot of other people. I saw it happening in pitch contests and stuff. I feel like it happened maybe like a year or two after my first book came out. We Need Diverse Books was definitely fully happening when my first book came out, but I think Own Voices was a little bit later. And so I didn't personally use that when I was pitching or anything like that. But I think We Need Diverse Books really helped my book find its home. And even when I was looking for an agent, I wanted to make sure it was an agent who had like in their bio or on their website that they championed diverse storytelling and that was something that was a priority to them. So if nothing else, it made more agents actually state that. And that definitely helped me on my journey.
Yeah, I could definitely attest to that. From my experience with Own Voices, I was able to find my agent through the event at DV Pitt. And I know that's helped so many marginalized authors find representation and get their stories out to intended audiences. Plus, I think it's also made it easier for readers to find and support queer authors.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to everything that Ashley and Rod just said, just as a reader, for one thing, just the number of books that I've fallen in love with over the past couple of years that I really believe would, either would not have been traditionally published or just the discoverability would have been lower, if not for Own Voices. Certainly also We Need Diverse Books. These are incredible books that have always been incredible books. And, when I entered the industry, I guess I sold my debut, which is Simon, in the end of 2013. So it was just before We Need Diverse Books, which I believe was like May of 2014. I felt like I got to watch it in real time. And I also, specifically We Need Diverse Books, I give that organization and the authors involved, LNO, all of this entire incredible group of authors who started this now nonprofit, that's a huge part in my mind of why Simon overperformed. So,
yeah. I guess I would agree with everything that everyone else has said. Only other thing that I can think to add is that I think that it's helped people, it's given people extra tools and extra language to read books and to interpret them. I think that it's helped us kind of draw a bit of a line between what is something that's problematic content versus something that is, someone who has experienced this exploring their own experience and looking at the messier side of things. I think it's a little bit easier in some ways to pass that out now than maybe it used to be, before we really thought much about who was writing the book and why they were writing the book.
In the best of cases, yes, I agree. I think just like you said, but I think and I'm sure we're gonna end up talking about this. I think it falls apart sometimes. I don't think we're great at using these tools in our conversation sometimes.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am. I'm actually curious, just a little bit about, from a queer point of view, the comfort level with using own voices, because in a lot of ways, I think sometimes, queer identities can be very invisible, right? A lot of people are not necessarily comfortable with being out. A lot of people can't be out for various reasons. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit later, and how all of that factors into it. And so I think for the rest of the conversation, we'll just sort of filter everything through a queer lens. I think the biggest misconception about writers is that we know everything, that we are like these receptacles of endless knowledge, including full enlightenment about who we are and also who we allow ourselves to be. But if I've learned anything from my own writing journey over the last 15 years, it's that writing is about discovery. It's about self-discovery. When I first started writing back in 2006, I was writing straight love stories because I was so deep in the closet that I couldn't even allow myself the ability to exist in fiction. And I think for a lot of people, it might be the opposite. So that for me, it was such a deep-rooted fear. Reading queer books like David Sedaris at the time felt really risky for me. And once I started to process and accept myself in bits and pieces, my awareness of my identity evolved. And I allowed myself on the page more and more until my debut, Can't Take That Away, when I was finally able to breathe and live authentically, both in real life and on the page. So I'm curious about each of you, and how much did you have figured out about yourselves when you first started writing versus who you are today?
Oh, that's a lot.
Oh.
Do you want to go alphabetically, Becky?
We can
I mean,
whammy over there.
I guess it depends.
Okay, I'll go first. Oh, gosh, when I first started writing manuscripts, I really had no clue about my bisexuality. It was only during the process of writing my manuscript, Chasing Pacquiao, that just opened a floodgate of queer memories of when I was younger. Crushes I had on baseball players and classmates, and stuff that I never fully processed because I met and fell in love with my future wife at such a young age. We met in the 9th grade, and just writing that manuscript was such a revelation to me. Just really made me come to terms with who I really was. And so, I've only been out for about 2 months now, and, I'm learning that it's okay for me to say out loud in conversation, like, hey, that guy over there is pretty cute. And now my wife and I can have fun discussions about guys who we think are hot. That's a plus. And so it's really opened our relationship up so much.
So I have been writing since I was really, really, really little, like primary school little. I've basically always written from the perspective of guys, but like you were saying, Stephen, it was mostly straight guys, basically all the way through to my very late teens. And then I wrote a couple, I think I wrote a few queer side characters, and I noticed for a couple books in a row that I was much more interested in what they were up to than my straight main couple, like to the point where I was like, I didn't want to write about my straight main couple, and I was like, well, why not? I'll just write whatever I want, because back then, you know, there were kind of no real discussions about what you should or shouldn't be writing, so I was just following whatever I was interested in, whatever was capturing my attention. And yeah, I wrote a couple of books that centered queer main characters, and from that point, I did not stop doing that. And that I wrote my first queer main character probably in 2013, 2014, and it wasn't until mid 2015 that I realized and started telling people what I identified as. And, you know, I don't necessarily think that that is the end of a journey either. I think that for me, and probably for a lot of us, we realize something and then we realize maybe something else, or that first something is something a little bit different to what we initially thought it was, and onwards and upwards. But it started in 2015, I think.
I also, like Sophie, started writing when I was super young. And so it's hard to, I mean, I definitely had no clue who I was when I was like 12 and I was like writing stories. I did, however, have a pretty strong preoccupation with, any gay story that I found. So like I was reading like every gay book that I could find, which was usually gay white boys, right? Boy Meets Boy for a very long time was like one of my favorite books. Still to this day is one of my favorite books, but it was a book that I would reread every year from the time I was, I don't even know, whenever it came out. I think I was like 15 or 16. And I didn't really understand my preoccupation with that and with these characters until much later. And then in my first novel, in The Beauty That Remains, one of the main characters is a gay white boy. And I am obviously not a gay white boy. But I think that it felt, because of all the books that I had been reading and all the books that I had loved, I think that exploring queerness through that lens felt very safe. And it was later that year, like shortly after, I think it was while I was writing that book and shortly after that book sold, that I was like, oh, wait, like maybe I'm not as straight as I thought I was. And then sort of, you know, thinking about my past, thinking about a lot of the relationships that I had, you know, very complicated, intense, very emotional, with like romantic bends, with multiple people, you know, in the past. And, you know, through therapy and sort of recasting that and like relooking at it and thinking about heteronormativity and the role that that played, thinking about religion and the role that that played in my life. And, you know, in a roundabout way, I was like, oh, wait, you know, this is actually, there is something here. And I still wasn't exactly sure what it was. And I'm not super sure what it is now, but I just know that I'm not straight. And so that is sort of the way, I think I'm still sort of discovering it and working through it and figuring it out. But needless to say, I have had a lot of relationships in my life that were not straight relationships in the way that we think of them. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my stuff is, I mean, like Rod, all pretty recent, and like not the most fun story at times. Although I do think like parts of it are hilarious, and I gotta like, I'd love to get to the place where I can just like really enjoy the humor of the fact that like, I mean, I guess it starts with the fact that I'm like in my late 30s and I grew up in a conservative, what was then much more conservative, a conservative suburb of Atlanta. So, I grew up in the just congressional district that sent Newt Gingrich to Congress, and so much of it was just like also the way kind of, just labels were talked about kind of then, at least kind of in my social context. I knew I liked boys. I knew bisexuality was a thing, kind of like Maureen from Rent, and I was not like her because she did not treat people well. And she, I mean, I love that show. She definitely, checked off a lot of the boxes of kind of just the first like 5 stereotypes you could think of for bi women, that's sort of what I was working with. And so like, I'm this kid who, like I can see so much of myself in all of your stories too. Like Ashley, I'm like drawn to reading certain stories and consuming certain stories, watching certain animes, the fan fiction that I wrote, the kinds of music that I like. It was like, it was so loud and I didn't hear it, it was like, I volunteered with queer kids for almost a decade. I got my doctorate. My doctoral dissertation was on working with queer clients in like an affirming way. Like this, like literally wrote a doctorate, like a doctoral dissertation. Like I was a clinical psychologist. Like it's ridiculous. And then I write this book. Simon's my debut. It's the first time I've ever really tried to write a novel. And it sold in 2013, and I kind of did a little bit of a different publishing landscape. Like nobody really expected it to blow up. It was definitely like given a lot of in-house love and support. And I am with the same publishing house and with the same editor, and I've been so happy there. But I'm still out there. In 2015, my book is coming out. I'm being asked in interviews, like, it's hard to remember if I'm being asked how I identified or if I'm just being asked about my straightness. But, that was sort of a thing that came up a lot. It was a thing that I kind of, like, I was painstakingly careful not to overstep with that. Like I didn't even want to explore any questions because it felt like appropriating or something. I don't know. I just I sort of felt like this was sort of my persona, I guess. And and also I'm out there giving interviews talking about like Simon Spear is like the most, his voice is my voice. He's completely similar to me. The biggest difference between us is that I'm more self-aware than Simon, which is hilarious. For years I said that, like it's so funny. Yeah. And then and even after, and these conversations are coming up. When the movie came out, it was really, and also Leah on the Offbeat, which we wrote about, Leah is a bi girl. When those two came out in 2018, it was horrible. It was like, it was like I had been kind of a public straight person for my entire career. It was a big part of the conversation. There were boycotts. There were like people kind of within my professional community who had just like a lot of opinions about it. And then I, for a couple of years, like after that, like at some point I took the thing off my website that said I was straight. I stopped answering those questions in interviews. Like I would say, I'm not, I'm not answering that. And I still at the time was like, I'm taking a moral stand against authors being compelled to and pressured to answer those kinds of questions as a straight ally. Like, so it's a wonderful ally. I refuse to answer those questions. It was like by the time I actually pieced this all together and started privately coming out over the summer right before my essay, it was like I came out to Adam Silvera and he was like so confused. He was like, oh, he's like, this is great. Did we not talk about this in 2018? And I was like, I did not know. So,
Becky, don't feel bad about not being self-aware when like everything was super loud, because I fully had a Tumblr that was all boobs, and literally the little like blurb description thing was I'm just a straight girl who loves boobs.
That's great.
So every time, like, I'm pretty sure it's still there, and I will send you a link to it because it's the most hilarious thing to look at now. I'm like, wow, the signs were everywhere.
I love you.
That is great.
Yeah.
What's really I'm gonna put on my teacher hat now, because I'm a college professor and I'm constantly making connections for my students. But the one thing that I'm hearing from everybody's story is that y'all didn't have everything figured out when you were 12 years old, 15 years old, 16 years old, 20 years old, 25. It goes on and on, right? Like we as queer people, we don't always have everything figured out from the time that we're super young. And we might not have everything figured out when we're 85 years old. I volunteer at a local LGBTQ center, and I have taught a writing class to a group of seniors. And so many of their stories were about how they didn't figure anything out about themselves until they qualified to participate in a senior memoir writing class at the local LGBTQ center, right? So like, I think it's so problematic for people to assume that we as writers know everything from the time that we start writing stories. From what I hear from Sophie and Ashley and Rod and Becky, it's like everybody was exploring different facets of themselves through their writing before they even figured it out. And to touch on something that Ashley said, not even sure, how necessarily to label yet. And things are constantly shifting and evolving. And so I think it's really important for anybody watching, especially if you are not out yet, or you haven't quite figured it out, like it's okay for you to not have things figured out. It's okay for it to be a question mark, right? And even if you have a label that you feel like fits you, that might change, that might shift, and that's okay for that to shift and to continue to evolve. So I want to sort of talk a little bit about visibility, which I think Becky was sort of getting at with her last response, right? Because going back to own voices, right? Like there's always this obligation on the part of authors, if they're using own voices, to be fully transparent about who they are. Right? But sometimes identity is not so cut and dry, right? And things are constantly shifting. For me, like my personal story, after I wrote Can't Take That Away, I used own voices in my query letter because I knew that I was genderqueer, but the rest of the world did not. I did not actually tell my husband until after I sold the book. I like had to sit him down and like I cried in bed because I didn't know how he would take it. Like we've been together for 9 years at that point. But it was like stuff that I had processed on my own in therapy. I think I had told one other friend at the time. But I wasn't out yet. And I was really, really worried about the discourse around my book. What right did I have to write a genderqueer character? I need to be visible. I need to be out there. I need to put it in my bio on Twitter so that everybody in the world knows exactly who I am. And so I'm curious, right, about this aspect of visibility, right? On the one hand, authors who are closeted or just don't know who they are yet should be able to use own voices, right? But then there's that argument that like you will likely have to prove your identity. Is that a valid argument?
Hell no.
So,
Yeah, I mean, the being in the closet is such a huge part of the queer experience. I mean, it's obvious. Yeah, I don't agree with that at all. I mean, nobody asks straight writers to prove their identity. You know, nobody says to Nora Roberts, "Hey, hey Nora, I didn't quite buy that hetero love scene." Right? I don't think you're really straight, Nora. Are you? Nobody says that to straight writers.
Yeah,
I have a dual thing on this from like the industry perspective and then like the writer perspective, right?
I love it.
I think that if you are queer, whether you are public about it or not, and you're writing a book about a queer character, you should be able to use own voices in your pitch, right? Your pitch that is going to, publishers or agents or whatever. I should be able to use it. I don't think, or I guess it gets a little bit messier when it comes to how the publisher is pitching the book, right? Because if you used own voices in your pitch and then the publisher turns around and pitches it publicly that way, that is where it gets, I think, a little bit stickier, because at that point, it has been announced in a way, right? And once it is announced in a way, people feel, whether it's true or not, I don't think that it's true that anyone has a right to know anything about anyone else, right? Especially when it comes to what you do in your personal life, who you personally are. I think you should be able to pitch your book as own voices if you are own voices, whether you're out or not. But I think it gets stickier when the publisher is pitching your book as own voices if you're not out yet. And so I think that is a conversation that a lot of times publishers neglect to have that conversation with the author. If they just sort of go with whatever pitch they were given. But it might be a conversation that needs to be more that needs to happen more regularly, where if a pitch comes in as own voices and it is a queer identity, before or I guess as the editorial team or marketing and publicity or whoever is crafting their pitch, they come back to the author and say, okay, you used own voices. Are you okay with us using own voices to then, pitch this novel publicly?
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't know about anybody else's experience, but with my book, my publisher asked me, what are we allowed to talk about? What are we allowed to pitch for you? And I said, I do not want to be asked any questions about my identity. What I divulge is what I divulge. And I want to be in charge of that narrative. And it's my hope that for queer people everywhere that they get that same courtesy. And I don't think that that's the case.
Right.
I remember the constant anxiety of every single time you're sent an interview and you're scanning the questions and you see that question and you're just like, or like going on like live panels and being terrified that someone's gonna ask something. So you're kind of always trying to like cut it off and have those conversations before anyone can like ask you. But then sometimes people will assume things that you didn't realize that they would assume and they run with it, like Ashley kind of said. But you know, it's there's a lot of terror around that, and I think that harm is really important.
I mean, I feel that so much. I completely relate to that. And what's really wild is that I'm only now beginning to wrap my mind around the idea that like it doesn't have to be that way. I didn't deserve that. You know, like I felt like I wrote in this space. I made this decision. I didn't understand the implications of it at the time, but I made the decision to write this book, Simon, and what I deserve is to be every single day of my life for years to be asked that question, sometimes friendly fire, sometimes not, you know? So.
And when you wrote Simon, when you sold Simon, that wasn't really happening. I don't remember, you know, establishing who the author is and what right they have to write this. That wasn't really a thing back then. So how is that informed? How is that you making a choice that you're okay with if the conversation then changes so abruptly a couple of years later and you're basically the figurehead for it? Because that's kind of what happened, because you were so visible at the time. People just turned to you and it kind of all fell back on you, and you didn't sign up for that because, well, I wouldn't say any of us signed up for it, even, you know, when we did know, but you especially. It wasn't even happening yet.
Yeah, I think it needs to be said and it needs to be heard. It needs to be very explicit. Stop making Becky Albertalli your fall person. Stop. See, like everybody out there who is listening to this, like Becky is valid. She deserves and she is owed this space as a queer person. And everyone needs to back off because and it's not even just about Becky. And I love you, Becky. It's not just about, but it's about every single queer writer who has ever existed and who will exist in the future. And that I think is the most important thing that we need to underscore. Everybody out there who's writing to explore themselves and to figure things out and parse out their identity, keep doing that, because that's a beautiful thing to be able to do as a writer, I think, anyway. So, you know, that's what I have to say about that.
I also think identity policing is really dangerous, because I mean, even just you could take any identity and it not be visible, right? Mm-hmm. Disability. You don't know what is happening inside of someone's body or inside of someone's brain, right? And for you to make an assumption and then to, you know, sort of take action behind that assumption, it's dangerous. Even race. Right? Like you can look at someone and think you know what you see, but you don't. My child does not look Black at all. And he is 50% Black. And so I don't know. It's like in these moments, we have to be really careful with who we decide gets to write what and why we decide that we are the authority on whatever the narrative is. Because ultimately, you don't know anyone's identities unless you ask them what they are. And even then, they're only telling you what they know in that moment.
What they will say.
Right. So I don't know. I think on top of it being, you know, abusive sometimes, it's also just dangerous because it can affect so many different people in so many different ways.
Yeah, I think Ashley sort of blends into my next question, which is really all about the online discourse and the policing of queer identities online. There seems to be this argument, right, that I've sort of been underscoring that of what people are saying, right, that you need to be visible in order to be able to write something, and if people out there don't immediately see what they want to see from a writer, it's almost like there's this pile-on or this policing that happens. And again, I'm specifically centering this around queer writers. So my question is, why do you think that this policing happens? And then how has this discourse impacted you and the stories that you tell as a queer writer?
I remember back at uni, I studied philosophy for a little while. And one of the first things that you're taught when you're like just starting out is that all of the different ways that an argument can be incorrect, or just the very foundation and premise of it being correct. What I see is one of the most common ones where you assume something must be true and then you go on from that. So what a lot of people are kind of doing, what I'm seeing is that they're assuming, not even addressing, just saying, okay, well, we all know that it is very harmful if someone writes outside of their lane when it comes to queer people, or, that you need to be queer to write these stories. And therefore, we're going to take that premise that there can't be anything wrong with and extrapolate that and say, well, given that that is causing so much harm and that is so important, how are we going to deal with it? And if that were the case, I can kind of see where the rest of the arguments are coming from, because people are saying, well, what do we do about that? Well, we need to make sure that the people who are writing these stories have this identity. We need to ask them. They need to expect to be asked, rah, rah, rah. But I would go all the way back to that initial premise and say, who decided that? Who decided that the most important thing in this whole conversation is that we establish that only the people who are allowed to write this are writing this? That is the thing that needs to be addressed, because if you're assuming that that's correct, then yeah, the rest does make sense, but that isn't necessarily correct. And I don't feel like we spent anywhere near enough time talking about that. It was just treated like an assumption and everyone ran with it. Sorry, I'm getting angry.
I think, like, going off of what Sophie said, I think the assumption comes from a place of pain, right? Because someone has been hurt in the past, or has seen someone they care about hurt in the past because of this, someone writing outside of their experience. And then, and also, I mean, there are a lot of harmful queer narratives already, right, that exist in the world as it is. And so I think, I don't think that everyone comes at it like, oh, just because this person isn't queer, they shouldn't be writing the story, even though that is a huge part of it. I think it comes from, like, beyond that is like pain, right? And they're like, I have been hurt in the past by this situation, and so I can't let this situation happen again. Or I'm trying to protect other kids from being hurt the way that I was hurt. And so I can't let this stand, right? I think a lot of it comes from that. And I don't know that there is a way to address that directly, right? Because that pain is real, and that pain has already happened, and there's nowhere for it to go. I think, everybody has to work on healing themselves based on their own experiences, right? But not everybody is in a place to do that, and not everybody has the resources or the time to do that. And so I think it gets, I don't know, it gets complicated when you think about it in that way, right? Like, if someone has been hurt, I understand why they would be so angry.
No, but yeah, I think that what you kind of said in there was the important part to me, hearing that, relating it back to what I was saying, was that there is no way to easily address that. And I guess I understand the pain, and that's real and that's valid. It is, we can't deny that there has been harm done, but I would probably push back against what some people are saying, not yourself, but what some other people are saying, that, they think that the best way to move forward is, well, we'll just make sure that only people who share the identity write about it. But you can have internalized homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, all sorts. You can still write harmful rep if you're from a community, and not everyone who isn't from a community will automatically write harmful rep. So the problem is real, but probably, like you said, this isn't necessarily the best solution for the problem. Maybe there isn't a solution.
I mean, maybe the solution is everybody should just read the books first.
Right?
Wow, what a concept!
Novel concept. I love that. I love that advice. Let's rename the panel. Everyone should read the books.
Read the books first.
Right? Yeah,
Hold your
exactly.
judgment until you read the book.
Yeah.
or feel empowered to not read the books. Like, truly, like,
Right. Also,
I'm like, if you want to read only your own voices, like, oh my God, that's fine. That's fine.
That's great. Do it. Yeah.
Great, it's great. Yeah. Whew.
Yeah, I think the actual work, the actual writing gets lost in all this policing. People it's like, how can you judge something when you haven't even read it too? It's like,
Yeah.
and I think as far as the acquisitions level, some editors, I think they police because they don't want to be seen as supporting what some might view as inauthentic stories. And just for me personally, it affected me at the acquisitions level. An editor was very interested in repping Chasing Pacquiao, right up until she found out I have a wife, and I wasn't out at the time, so I hadn't even discussed my bisexuality with my wife. So of course I wasn't going to confide it to a stranger.
Yeah.
And it was really disappointing. Because that editor hadn't even considered the possibility that I may be bi and in the closet. She just assumed I wasn't queer. And our month-long communication of notes and revisions just went out the window like that. So yeah, it was heartbreaking to come so close to landing a deal, only for her to back out based on assumptions that had nothing to do with my writing.
Yes. I would even be a little bit more uncharitable, and sometimes, I'm not saying it's the case for every publishing house or every editor, but I think sometimes it's a little less about wanting to not do harm and a little more about wanting to not be accused of doing harm, which I think is maybe an important line, which is where you stop looking at whether the story itself is actually good and start paying more attention to, will people say things? Will other people say this author shouldn't be writing this? Well, we can't risk that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that is a really good point. And like, this is me sort of jumping back into like the industry mode too. Like, I've definitely been in the room when those conversations have been happening. And it is a real fear, not only for the reputation of the publishing house or the reputation of the editor, but the reputation of the author. Like a lot of publishing houses and editors are interested. I mean, there are those out there, right, who are just like in it for the one book and like they don't really care what happens next. But a lot of editors, I think some of the best editors and some of the best publishers, they're interested in building a career. And they don't want an author to come out of the gate in a way that could sink them from the very start, you know? So yes, feel free to be uncharitable. That is absolutely a conversation that happens. But I also think that sometimes there is also a positive bend to it at times where they're like, okay, maybe this isn't the book this person should debut with, right?
Yeah.
or maybe this person isn't ready to be the face of this book yet, which, you know, I think should be left up to the author. But I do know that those are conversations that happen, and sometimes it is the editor and the publisher sort of making those choices.
I mean, I don't have much to say about solutions, at least right now, but I can, I mean, I have a lot to say about just how the discourse has affected me. I think, I mean, I was traumatized. I think I had a traumatic coming out experience. Like, I think it was traumatic. It is something that, like, every single day is, like, extensively on my mind. I mean, like, first of all, poor Sophie, who, like, the number of texts and stuff Sophie gets of me just, like, spiraling about this. But yeah, like, you know, in addition to kind of what I mentioned before about kind of the way it, I would say, made it harder to figure things out, made me not want to give myself that space to think and to even make room for the possibility. Like, you know, I think when I posted my coming out essay last year, like, I think some of the things I said collided with parts of the discourse that were kind of just, you know, very ingrained at this point. And like, it's hard to say, like, if there's any, I don't know that there's any way I could have come out and kind of encountered less friction. I don't think it's fair for me to have to ask myself those questions about, like, did I come out the right way? You know, like, but, like, to give you a little bit of a taste of, like, kind of what I heard after I came out, after I shared this, which, again, I did not want to do. By the time that question came up of, like, am I going to have this conversation? Like, it wasn't just, you know, for me, it wasn't just like, is this even relevant? You know, like, it's not going to change my life. Like, those weren't the main questions. The question was, I have, you know, 90,000 Instagram followers, you know, everybody I know, like, I put this out there, that's, it's out, you know, like, that's, I can't, I can't do this in stages. Like, I can't do this discreetly. I want to be very clear that you watching this possibly, probably can. And it is okay to be out in some places and not others. It is okay to not be out. I felt like I didn't have a choice. It was like every day something, and I don't just mean, like, from teens in pain. It typically not teens. Like, I'm talking about well-known authors. I'm talking, you know, my colleagues, just people, you know, people who I've blurbed, you know, people who I've supported. And after I put that out there, most people were wonderful, especially, like, in the author community, the book community. I will say, obviously, without naming any names, that I would say probably heard from about 100 people within this industry in different roles of this industry who could relate, who either chose not to write something because they didn't want to have to go through that, who were currently working on a book like that and were trying to figure out how they were going to come out and what that was going to look like, or just people who felt like they just didn't have the space to think about it. You know, just, like, so many different, like, I mean, I can't tell you how many people I heard from, more than you think. And Probably not more than y'all in this room think, because I feel like we kind of maybe have some unique insight here. But I was I was like the topic of conversation. Like there was discourse about me, and I'm a person who lives. I'm just like I'm here in my bedroom right now. Like I I'm there. I've got like 5 bins of laundry that I have not folded. Like this. Like I'm not discourse. Like I'm not. I don't. I've never wanted to like represent anything or position myself as like the center of any subset of this community or this like conversation. Like I don't want to be the middle of any of this. And I have tried to, for years, of course, like use my platform. It is a gift and a privilege to have the platform that I have. I try to use it. I take it seriously, but yeah, I mean, people straight up said like that I was lying for profit, lying to get out of criticism, that I had been lying and saying that I was straight in order to get a book deal because publishing favors straight women. I mean, obviously, most people who were kind of following this, there was a huge conversation about kind of how I got weepy when I was weepy when I was asked simple questions, innocent questions about my identity by people who of course would want to know. And it's hard to contradict that without pointing to examples. But in my case, the examples would I have the kind of platform that like if I give an example, it's gonna lead to a pylon. So I'm like, I'm not gonna throw somebody under the bus. Especially because most people again, like it's so important too what Ashley said, most people really are coming from a place of pain. I'm not trying to add to that for anybody. But like, oh my God, y'all, like think about like what you say, like think about who are you, like if a total stranger shares something like this for you and you or share something like this with you and like you think you think my experience is like better than I do. I didn't share everything in that essay, and I didn't have to. I didn't have to share any of it, but I did. And it's still like, I mean, to this day, people are still like, oh, she's still not a gay guy. No, I've never claimed to be. She still shouldn't. She's still not on Voices. I've literally never called myself on Voices. No, that's not true. I mean, I have for Jewish stuff and like fat rap and things like that, but no, not even for Leon the Offbeat. I've never said it. I've never said I'm on Voices for that.
As you were talking, I couldn't help but think about what it was like to be in the closet and to be terrified of coming out. And the first time I came out, however long ago that was, I just remember like being terrified of what my parents would think, not what 90,000 Instagram followers would think, not what the entire world would think, not like it was like comparatively, I just think of what queer people have to go through, right, in order to find the courage to say those words, however it is that they say them. But to have them be forced out and then to have to endure people just constantly coming at you from all sides of the internet and like disembodied heads tweeting, all of that stuff. Like, I want every person who's listening to this, if you're queer and you're out, and I want you to think about how you might have participated in this, even if you didn't know that you were participating in this, right? It might be somebody else, not Becky, but somebody else in your life who maybe you thought you were owed a part of them. I hate what you had to go through. And so now I'm just over here getting emotional. So I'm gonna just stop for a hot second.
I mean, it's violence at the end of the day. It's violence.
I mean, first of all, thank y'all. And I want to be clear too. Like, it's really hard to compare anybody's experiences to anybody else's. And I also want to say, like, my family, like, I did have to come out to my family, and they were great. That's lucky. Like, that's not something that everybody has. And even if they hadn't been great, I am a grown ass person who, I'm not stuck like it with hostile family members or something like that. It's just like, that was my experience. And I maintain that it was traumatic, and that that I deserve to feel the way I feel about it. But it was also absolutely, it's like, I don't think that's worse than Stephen, like, you being scared of what your parents, it's just like, there's no way to compare that. Like, that's so real too.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to be allowed the space to come out when you feel comfortable coming out, right? And I think it's all a part of the online discourse that happens, of people wanting to know who you are and feeling like they need to know who you are. And yeah, I don't know. I think
leave Becky alone.
yes, yes.
I know. Yeah, I'm just getting pissed off all over again listening to it. I'm ready to kill for you.
I mean, and I also want to say too, like, I just want to, like, I want to put this out there. Like, I feel like, I have talked about some of this stuff, like, so explicitly that there are definitely some people who are like, okay, this is a shitty thing to do to Becky. However, this other book is totally written by a straight woman. And I'm like, no. Like, we're not doing this. We're not doing this. This is the same thing. Like, we don't know. Like, I mean, I don't know this person. Like, it's just like other authors, I'm thinking of a book that's really popular on TikTok that I have no idea about the author's identity. And I'm surprised that so many strangers seem to know. Don't do that. Take what you learn here, and don't just apply it to me, and don't just apply it to the people on this panel. Like, just take that step and, like, think about that, and apply it to kind of other authors, big authors, like, like smaller indie authors, like everyone. Like, yeah.
One of the questions that I want to ask is sort of wrapped up in what you were just saying, Becky. Right, like, one of the most infuriating and illogical arguments that I've seen in this discourse is the women writing gay men equals fetishization. Why can't I say that word? Fetishization. Right? And it's a hard word. It's really hard, y'all. Like, honestly, I don't even know. But right, like, this argument that, like, women writing gay characters is like fetishizing them. And I think that what's really important to recognize about the faultiness in that argument is that it supposes that, like, that people who are writing these stories, are both women and heterosexual, right? And that gender and sexuality are concrete and immovable, and nothing changes and nothing evolves, and there is no realization anywhere in somebody's life, right? The lives of these writers. So I think what's really harmful about that is that it lends itself to not just rampant homophobia, but transphobia and biphobia as well. And so I don't know if we have the answers to this, but is there a way that we can change this discourse to like let people see how homophobic, transphobic, biphobic these lines of thought are?
Forgive me for my often use of intersection here, but like I feel like there's certain identities that I can't separate from each other for myself personally. And so often when I'm thinking of one, another one just comes at the same time. So I know that this is a queer panel, but I will often be talking about race at the same time. But I will always come full circle. So this is really important and interesting to me because sort of what I was saying before about how writing about, white gay boys felt very safe. I think we have to, whenever we talk about this and we think about this and we think about the stories that people are writing, we have to think about the history of what was, who was holding the keys to the gate, right? And that was largely white men, largely straight white men, right? But the closest thing to straight white men is a gay white man. Above white women, above people of color, above any other queer person who might have another intersection, right, is a gay white man. So you have a cis white man, and then you have a gay white man. Usually both people with money, right? Like rich cis white man, well off, gay white man. And so I think when we think about, people writing outside of their experience, and specifically women writing gay men, usually those are the first queer stories that anyone would have encountered. And I bring up race also because I know a lot of people of color who the first stories that they were writing were white characters because that was what they saw and that was what they read. And that's what they thought books were supposed to be about. They thought books were supposed to be about white people because that was what was available. Yeah. That's what I have to say about that.
I'm so glad you said that. I'm so glad because I've had the same thoughts, and I'm calm down. I think, when I've seen a lot of people, initially it used to be the conversation was straight women. And more recently, I've seen a lot of people be very quick to say, well, bi women do it too, because they...
For some of that change in the discourse, and won't blame me, so...
How awful is that? How awful is it? Yeah, I've seen a lot of people specifically say, yes, bi women fetishize. Okay. So the context is so important because especially for basically everyone who is old enough to be publishing books were raised where in this environment where queer men are gay, white, cis men. So when we were all growing up, that is what we had access to. That is the representation that we had. So that was like the framework with which we had to understand ourselves. We had to say, how am I similar to that? How is that me? Because we didn't have anything else, right? So, and then I think fandom and fan fiction comes into that a lot as well, because a lot of people, bi women very much included, explored themselves and queerness through online fan fiction because it was a lot of the time it was the only place you could find stories. I think, there were definitely queer stories before Simon, but after Simon, there's been a huge shift in publishing, feeling like it can make money off these stories and it can put these stories out there and there will be readers. So I think pre that there was so little to choose from. So what you're kind of saying is you've got these, let's talk about queer women. Let's just talk about queer women for now, because this particular argument is, I think, most applicable to them. in response to what people are saying. So they're growing up reading about cis white gay men. That is how they're learning to understand themselves. That is the access, that's the only stories they're able to access. They're writing about it because when you read about this, you kind of write about it, like you guys were all saying earlier, like that is what you think a story is. So that's how they're learning to write these queer stories. Now, fast forward a little bit, and only a few years ago, female, and honestly, it's still not the same. It is not selling as well. It's not, the sales are were, especially compared to male, a lot lower. It was a lot harder to get readers. It was a lot harder to get sales. In a lot of ways, a lot of people viewed this as, if I write this, I will be killing my own career. Not cool. Not okay. And this is only a few years ago. It's different today, I would say. But it's not perfect, but it's different. So it was kind of this choice between, I will either write about straight people or I will write about gay men. And I've been raised on gay men. These are the stories I've seen. These are the stories that I understand. I've been exposed to these stories. When I sought out queer stories, that is what I saw. That is what I got. That is what I've been consuming my whole life. I understand this. This feels like me. So, and I can't write female anyway, because, you know, it's really hard to sell it. It's really hard to make money off it. So therefore I'm going to go do this. And then people turn around and they say, that is wrong. That is wrong for you to do that. You are taking things, you are, you know, stepping into a space where you shouldn't be. And it's like, that is their space. That's the space that they were given their whole lives. That was the only space that they were given their whole lives. And yes, things are changing over the last couple of years, but a couple of years can't outweigh 20, 30, 40 years plus of that being the only space that you had. And then just to be told, well, you need to get out of it now. That's a lot.
And then also to add to that, just this, I know I'm gonna have to say that long word, fetish, that word, you know, to add that whole component to like when we speak about that, like my understanding is, you know, there is a sexual connotation to that, which, and I certainly believe that like sex and you know, any of these issues do have a place in the conversation, but that is quite a thing to lob at a specific person for you know, particularly for this reason that, you know, Ashley and Sophie have like not touched upon, have explained like so perfectly. You know, like if you kind of, you know, just out there participant in the discourse haven't like unpacked all of that, you know, there's like a decent chance that you are just straight up calling somebody a fetishizer in a way that like kind of like says like you speaking about you know, just kind of the nature of their sex drive, kind of. If does it make sense? Like, yeah. It's invasive. Yeah. Feels invasive, I think.
I think also it sort of speaks to, I think, a problem when it comes to queerness in general is that it was always seen as obscene, right? Mm-hmm. And so for people to so quickly go in their minds and in their language to using sexual connotations for, you know, for things, when you wrote a love story that ended with someone kissing on a Ferris wheel, like what? Like, how did we get here? Like, what was that train of thought? And like, how did this station even get on the map? Like, I think that when it comes to queerness, people do automatically go to like a very intense place when it doesn't necessarily need to be a part of the conversation. So even like using using that kind of language, I think, really speaks to the way that we have historically thought about queerness and thought about queer people. And, you know, sort of, it's another box, right, that we're trying to put people in. Oh, like if you are attracted to the same sex, or if your gender is presented in a certain way, then you must be doing lewd things in the bedroom. Like, it just so like, how did we get from A to B? Like, it's just such a jump. Yeah, so I think that that's part of it too. And I think maybe we need to challenge the way that we consider what a queer person, you know, the life that a queer person lives. And I think a lot of those assumptions come from, you know, queerness being othered for so long, when really at the end of the day, like, we're all doing the same shit for the most part. Like we're watching Netflix and like ordering takeout. Like, sorry.
That is, I loved all of that. That, and I haven't thought about a lot of that in that way before. So I think that is like, really, really, really good points. I think, you know, when you were mentioning intersectionality before, it's made me think of the fact that own voices, it doesn't, because of the reasons that you mentioned, it doesn't always neatly apply to like any marginalization. There's always going to be cases where there's a gray area. But what I kind of think with this particular discourse is that the people who are using it are in a lot of ways taking language that was meant to describe a different power dynamic and apply it to something different. So, for example, just one example, I think about white people writing people of color. There's a very clear power dynamic happening there. But you can't take that, you know, and apply it to women writing men, because the power difference is not the same as between white people and between people of color. But it doesn't neatly transfer. But some people act like it does. Like it's, well, you're kind of like this implication that women are oppressing men somehow, and it's like, okay, well that's a big claim. Like, can we talk about that a little bit more? But again, it's just kind of left there like, well, you know, we all know that white people shouldn't be writing people of color because of this very valid reason, so therefore women shouldn't be writing men. And it's like, wow. That's a jump.
That's a big leap.
Yeah, it's not the same situation. It's not.
Yeah.
Well, then when you start to get into kind of like the way people talk about just, is this specific author entitled to tell this specific story? And you start to see a lot of these like just straight up like biases and stereotypes sometimes like creeping into our decision making about that, even those of us who think we have thought about that. Like, think about how many times, you know, I have seen so many of these arguments that kind of, if you kind of unpack them and just sort of just dust them off a little bit, the argument is basically that, oh, bi men are gay and bi women are straight, you know? And it's like, you know, I mean, thinly veiled sometimes, you know, it's just like, or that non-binary people actually are whatever gender you, a stranger, like perceive them to be, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've actually seen this very recently start to get used against cis gay men as well. It's like the next level we're about to enter. I've already seen people say a cis gay man who is closeted can't claim own voices if writing about someone who's come out because they've never experienced that. And a cis gay man who came out with a loving family in a very progressive state can't write about someone who came out in a homophobic family in a conservative set. I've seen that. Like, I've seen people say that quite recently. And it's like, wow. So I think at the beginning, like there was a lot of like a straw man when Own Voices first came about, where people were like, what? So you're saying you can only write an autobiography to kind of shut down Own Voices? And, you know, that was in bad faith, I think. But in this scenario, it's starting to seem like, okay, but you're actually starting to say that, aren't you? You're actually starting to say, well, the people who are saying this, not everyone's saying this, but when you say that, you're saying that you should only write the very exact thing that you went through, otherwise you can't speak to it. Like, who are you to say what other people can speak to? Like, that's not what this is meant for.
Yeah, I think Sophie, sort of jumping off of that, one aspect of the conversation that we haven't quite discussed yet is cancel culture. And because I think that there is a very clear difference between something that is legitimately harmful representation of marginalized identities, right? Like, I think of the book whose title rhymes with Schmamerican Schmirt that came out, do with that what you will. And the fact, right, that there's a difference between that and the fact that queerness is not a one size fits all situation. And that, like, I look at everybody on this panel, we have vastly different stories, all of it, right? There are probably some overlapping situations and feelings and experiences, but we all have very different experiences. So, I think the cool thing, right, about publishing sometimes is that the books that are coming out, especially within the last like 5, 6, 7 years, are really showcasing such a vast field of different identities and experiences and outlooks. But this does tend to lend itself, right, to something that Sophie was just saying about like all the little nitpicky stuff. And then sometimes all it takes is one comment from one person online who says, this story does not represent me. I thought it was going to represent me, which is really like the subtext, right? Like, I thought this was going to represent me, but it didn't. And therefore I hate it because it's wrong. And so there seems to be this, like, sometimes this fear of getting canceled because readers may perceive something one way, and that's not really what, you're looking at like one tiny little blip of something. And so how do we as queer writers respond to this or tackle this, right? Because we're told as writers, we can't respond to anything. We have to keep our mouths shut. We have to be like good little children and just like sit and shut up at the dinner table and eat our broccoli. And I think this leads to like a closet-like effect for many queer authors. So I don't know, are there constructive ways that we as queer authors can tackle this? And I don't know, I want to start with you, Rod.
Well, yeah, I think Becky showed us the way with her brilliant essay, and I think that's a great way of refuting the harassment without engaging directly with the people who are attacking you. And it's tough because you would hope that it would be okay for authors to defend themselves online, but yeah, some people might see it as punching down, or and it's just a situation you really don't want to get involved in. So for me, I mean, after I read Becky's essay, it really inspired me to write my own, and it helped me clarify my thoughts and really write down exactly what I wanted to say and how all of this policing that affected me personally. And so, yeah, I think that writing a kick-ass coming out essay is a really good way to go. That's one avenue.
I mean, I like, just to jump on that too, like when I read Rod's essay, like I mean, some of y'all know this. Like, I mean, Rod obviously knows the story, but like, I was so moved by it. I like slid into Rod's like website contact form or something. I came in like as if Simon had found Victor, you know, and I was like, I'm gonna be that. I'm gonna be your absolutely clueless guide who has no idea what she's talking about, but I'm just like, oh my god, I see just like this, just reading your essay like helped me so much, you know, just to just feel like so much less like isolated in this
Oh,
experience. Yeah.
thank you. I mean, when it was really funny because when I got your email, I pretty much just screamed, and my wife was all, "What's going on?" I was like, Becky Overtally just wrote me. I mean, first I noticed that you followed me on Twitter, which was amazing in itself, and then I got an email from you, and it really, you reaching out to me just totally validated me writing that essay and coming out. And I would never have thought in a million years that someone of your stature would reach out to me like that. But not only for myself, but it really helped my wife to feel that we made the right decision. Because, yeah, to be honest, both of us are like, oh, we don't know how people are going to react to this. You know, I mean, of course, people are going to be scrutinizing our marriage, and we weren't sure if we wanted to deal with that. But you know, I think for the most part, the main reason why I did write it is for my son, just to show him that it's okay to be who you are and to let people know who you are, and to show people with pride. So, yeah, I mean, it just really blew me away though when I got your email, because, like I said, it was your essay that inspired me to write it, and I really, when you say that you're my Simon to my Victor, and that's kind of how I felt when we started communicating. I was like, this feels like fan fiction, you know, what I'm going through here. Like,
No, I mean, like the thing. Oh my gosh, I wish you I wish you would know like how incredible it is, like what you did, because like the amount of courage that it took to describe, especially your particular experience. And anybody who's watching this who has not read Rod's essay yet, please do, because like that's an experience that I hadn't been through, I couldn't speak to, and that we have not been including in this conversation. And that is like what this looks like in acquisitions, like what this means for writers who are entering the industry. What stories are we possibly missing out on? Like we are missing that entire part of the conversation. Like, I mean, like just like the courage that took, and just like kind of the precision with which you describe that. It's also like a lovely, hilarious, funny, beautiful essay too. It's just a beautiful piece of writing. But like, yeah, please, like, yeah, read it. It's so like this conversation cannot exist without that piece.
wow, thank you so much.
Yeah, Ashley, I'm actually kind of curious about your point of view on this from not a writer side, but from an industry perspective to sort of feed off of what Becky was just saying.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing we have to address is who actually ever gets canceled, right? Because there are some power dynamics at play when it comes to having this conversation. And I think that the more successful you are and the closer you are to a cis white man, the less likely it is that you will actually be canceled. That like the canceling will like have an effect on your life or your well-being or your money, your ability to make a living or to have a future. So I think that that is important to put out there first. Secondly, from an industry standpoint, I think that it's mostly just a massive pain in the ass. Cancel culture as a thing is like for the industry is a pain in the butt. Like it is something that, and so as like my writer perspective is like, good. I'm glad you guys think it's a pain in the butt. Maybe it'll make you like work harder to make sure that you're not actually putting harmful fiction into the world. But from the industry perspective, I think that it does sort of put a fire under their asses in a lot of ways. Like I know personally, a lot of my friends who still work in the industry, there's a lot more conversations happening around getting, beta readers for things that normally wouldn't have even had a second glance, right? There are more conversations happening around covers and titles and names, and even if a word should be italicized in a book because it's another language, right? And I think that all of those changes and all of those thoughts and the thoughtfulness that goes behind all of those things are really great. And I think that it's making for stronger books and a stronger representation in general. But I also don't know that any of that would have happened without, movements like we need diverse books, of course, but also cancel culture. Like I think it scares people, and I think it has successfully scared enough people that the industry is taking notice, and the industry is not being nearly as careless as they had been in the past. And even those moments where, that carelessness is still showing up, because let's be honest, publishing houses still largely look the same. It's mostly straight white women. And so, mistakes are still happening. Things are still slipping through the cracks. But I think people are being a lot more conscientious than they were before. And I do think that there are steps being taken to make, publishing houses and marketing and publicity and editorial more diverse, more, the people who actually work there. So I think it's moving in the right direction, and I think cancel culture has a lot to do with it, unfortunately.
Really? Oh, yeah. Sorry, finish it. Yeah.
It.
No, I mean, I definitely, I don't love the idea of accepting that, because I don't know, for me, and maybe this is like a terminology thing, because cancel culture definitely has a specific set of connotations for sure. I don't consider myself as like canceled, and certainly it is not like negatively impacted my career. There's never the question, but but it is the same sort of the same kind of cautiousness and carefulness that has led to better books and stuff I don't mean to trivialize it at all, but has led to just more scrutiny over our own work. That's I mean, I was traumatized by kind of the way that played out, because we don't yeah, we don't have control, I think, over the conversation as much as I wish we do if we were going to be using it as a tool. And I mean, it's not that we this little group of us like get to decide whether cancel culture should be allowed to exist, and it's so complicated. It affects people so differently along all of the axes that you mentioned. And but I keep coming back to the idea that I'm like, yeah, well, if I hadn't been kind of harassed for years, I don't think I would have learned any, like I would probably have never kind of explored anything about my sexuality, so I guess, like, I'm glad I unpacked that. I'm glad I have given that the thought. I'm glad about the outcome. But I am not okay with how we got there. I don't think the harassment needed to be the way,
Yeah, I think that there is a difference between like online harassment, which I think you fully definitely got the full brunt of, right? There's public shaming, and then there's like cancel culture, right? I think these are all sort of subsets of the same thing. And I think that cancel culture in and of itself is super toxic. Absolutely agree. As well as, online harassment and public shaming. Like, all of these things are toxic behaviors, and they mostly have negative outcomes. But I think the one way that the industry has been positively affected by that is that they pay more attention and they're slightly more careful. Yeah. And I mean, I don't think that it is productive when it comes at one person. But usually when the canceling actually happens, there has been something harmful, right? Like something that is legitimately harmful. Usually. I can't think of an example of a cancel, like of someone who got canceled where they didn't actually do something that like deserved cancellation.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're talking about two different things, but what I think is like the piece of this that I'm getting stuck on is like, I do think, it is the same kind of hypervigilance maybe that is underlying both. So there is the like, like I want to make sure there's nothing problematic here. I want to make sure that I'm not getting canceled. I want to make sure that, just like, I want to make sure that my reading, the books that I read are by the people that I've been told they're supposed to be by, and so on and so forth. Like, I think it gets really slippery, and like when theoretically cancel culture and harass, or not even, I don't like to say cancel culture, but like a cancellation or a like an online critique of a behavior or something like that, theoretically that's different from harassment about identity. I think the entire problem is like in the way that stuff gets applied right now, at least. And I think that's what this conversation is about, is trying to sort of add a little bit of the nuance that can kind of separate that again. Does it make any sense?
It makes perfect sense. I think that's ultimately what I think a lot of the online discourse is missing, is nuance. And how nuanced can you be in like 240 characters on Twitter? Even in an elaborate tweet thread, sometimes the nuance isn't quite there. Because ultimately, right, like what I said earlier, the queer experience varies from person to person to person. And so I think the way to solve that problem is to publish more queer books. right? Like we need more queer narratives across the spectrum, across the world, across identity, across race, across, socioeconomic backgrounds. Like we need those queer stories. They are super, super important. So we are actually very close to the 2-hour mark, and I don't want to keep y'all here longer than you need to be. So I'm going to ask you just one more question. And that question is this, right? So queer authors are, I think, perpetually asking themselves, do I have the right to write this story? So what advice or message would you all like to send to specifically closeted or questioning queer writers who might be afraid to explore something about themselves in their work? How do we own our voices? What message do you send to them?
Well, I think we own our voices by writing what we love and writing what we must, and by not listening to identity gatekeepers, but to the voice inside us that says, this is my truth and I want the world to hear it.
Yeah.
Um,
Go, Sophie.
just that things are not great at the moment and you're not imagining it if you have fears, but there are those of us who have been and will continue to push back against that to make it safer for you to be able to write your story without being in danger.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when you start writing, it will feel freeing. And that is how you know that you are writing the story that you should be writing. Much like relationships, good ones feel good. And so you should just follow, when your writing feels good, follow that good feeling.
And I think, I guess the only thing I would add to all of this is just, this goes back to something, Rod, that you said almost at the beginning of this. It's just like the closeted experience, like the questioning experience, like these are valid queer experiences. Like what you are living right now is not only valid, but like, your story is something that that can be really meaningful to other people who, you haven't even met yet. I would love to read your story. So
it's also okay for it to be undefined. I think that's really important too. I spent so much time, years, looking for the perfect label for everything that I was feeling. And I never quite found it. And I'm finally just like, okay with that. So that's the other thing. Like, if you are waiting to come out because you're not sure what to say, you don't have to say anything specific. You can just say, like, this is how I feel. This is what I'm thinking right now. And it's also okay to not come out if you're not ready. So
I love that. And I think that's fantastic. So I just want to thank each and every one of you for coming today and doing this with us. Becky Albertalli, Ashley Woodfolk, Sophie Gonzalez, Rod Polito. Like, honestly, y'all are amazing. Chef's kiss perfect. Like, I think that this conversation is really going to help a lot of people and shed some light on some really important issues. So where can people find you and more about your work and all the beautiful things that y'all do?
Are we going alphabetically? I am, the best place to find me is Instagram, because I run that myself. Just Becky Albertalli, at Becky Albertalli, one word. I do also have a Twitter at the same handle that's run by my assistant. But he's amazing. So.
I'm on Instagram and Twitter. I'm mostly on Twitter because I can't really figure out Instagram yet. I can't even addicted either. Like I have to force myself to check it, but Twitter I don't even mean to. Anyway, at S Gonzalez Author is my app for both of them.
Yeah, same with me. I'm on Twitter and Instagram, though my Instagram game is very weak. I have no idea what I'm doing on it. But, feel free to follow me, Rade Pulido.
And I am Ash Wrights on both Instagram and Twitter.
And I'm Steven Salvatore. You can find me at Steven SS Wrights on Twitter, I think. I don't even know my handle. And at Steven Salvatore Books on Instagram. Thank you for joining us at Pride Book Fest 2021. We love you. Mwah.